There is a sense of positivity and optimism coming from Prime Minister Mark Carney's delegation in Washington today, following that afternoon meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House. The Minister for Canada-U.S. Trade, Dominic LeBlanc, described a sense of momentum between the two countries to move forward on trade deals.
Our job is to defend Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. The Prime Minister did that, I think, in a very significant way today. And the conversation between the two leaders left us very much with the sense that there's a desire to see how we can, starting with the steel and aluminum sectors, structure something that would be in the economic and security interests of both countries.
Meanwhile, here at home, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is in Ottawa to talk about her pitch for a new pipeline through to the coast of British Columbia. I spoke to Premier Smith earlier today before the Prime Minister's meeting with President Trump had wrapped up. Premier Smith, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Look, as we're having this conversation, the Prime Minister and the President, they're still meeting. We don't know the outcome of that, but there was some affection expressed for Mark Carney by the President today. I mean, what do you take from that, and what are your expectations and hopes for this particular meeting?
Well, we should be very happy about that. The President seems to do a lot of business around personal relationships, and I think it's an indication that he respects the Prime Minister. They seem to have a good personal relationship. I think we'd hope he'd be able to leverage that into an early agreement on the Canada-U.S. Mexico free trade agreement, or some kind of adjustment around the tariffs on steel and aluminum and cars, but I guess that remains to be seen if we end up with any kind of a deal. But I think it's a good sign that they seem to enjoy each other's company.
You and the Prime Minister seem to have a better personal relationship than you had with the last Prime Minister. Do you think you're any closer on getting a deal on the changes to the environmental laws you don't like, to support for a pipeline, to movement on pathways? Where's that after your meeting with Mark Carney?
You know, I hope so. I mean, when I look at how the Prime Minister campaigned during the last election, he talked about making Canada one of the strongest economies in the G7. He talked about being an economic superpower and an energy superpower, on conventional as well as new energy. And so I'm taking him at his word, and I'm telling him honestly what it would take to attract that private sector investment back, as well as what Alberta would need in order to be able to restart on some of the projects that have diminished our ability to develop our resources in the past. So it's a three-part proposal. Let's address the 9 bad laws in some way, either by repealing or revising them substantially. Affirm a bitumen pipeline to the coast, which all the pipeline companies tell me is the most economic option, and the one that will open up the most new markets and have the greatest opportunity for growth, and also the Pathways project to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You
suggested on a social media post, so that you might have some progress, or you hope to have some progress and clarity by the Grey Cup, which is what the Prime Minister has signaled. On changes to those 9 laws, did the Prime Minister in his meeting with you yesterday suggest you'd have an answer by then on changes they might make?
We've been working on all of the aspects that I just mentioned for a couple of months now, and so I know that I've got a negotiating team at the table. He does as well. And I would hope that what we would be able to come up with by Grey Cup is a comprehensive understanding of how those things will be addressed, so that the 2 projects that we think are going to be important to Alberta's economic interests and the country's interests.
Pathways and pipeline, those are the 2?
Those 2. We would hope that they'd be on the list in Grey Cup, or an indication that they're going to be.
Do you think it's an indication of they will repeal these laws, or is it an indication that they would use the powers in C5 to grant exemptions from certain requirements around the emissions cap and around the tanker ban to make a bitumen pipeline go if Pathways goes? I mean, what's the mechanism you see working there?
Well, some things I would say could be repealed, some things not implemented at all, some things substantially revised. And I think we've seen that he's prepared to be pragmatic on that. First, the action he took was to eliminate the carbon tax, the retail carbon tax. He also has put a pause on the implementation of the net zero vehicle mandate, which I think, realizing it just couldn't be implemented by January of 2026. So I think as he's looking through each of these, he's doing the assessment of what he can do to be able to address the concerns that not only I've expressed, but business leaders have expressed as well.
But I guess I wonder, what is the sense you have from your conversations with the Prime Minister? Is this something that will definitely happen? Or is this something that he's just willing to consider?
It will have to definitely happen, because if we don't end up repealing or replacing a lot of these laws, then the private sector won't step up to expand production.
Well, I know that's your opinion, but what is Mark Carney saying to you about his intention on this is what I'm trying to get clarity
if there isn't a willingness to expand production, then there isn't a need for a pipeline. And if there isn't a need for a pipeline, there isn't a need for the Pathways project. They're all connected. So I would say that he understands that. I've been pretty clear that if you're going to be able to pay for a substantial investment in new technology like the Pathways project, which may cost 10 to 20 billion, you need a new revenue source for it. And Alberta has, if we had seen the 3 pipeline projects built that had been proposed over the years, we would have another 2.5 million barrels a day of production. We're seeing different projections that the world is going to need 120 million barrels a day by 2050. We want Alberta and Canada to be a larger share of that growing market. And we think that we've got the best value proposition if we can also couple that with reducing emissions. So that's what we've got on the table. I'll be and I hope we can come to an agreement.
Since we last spoke, we had your predecessor, Jason Kenney, on the show, and he had some pretty choice words for David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia, calling him a bigger threat to Confederation than the Alberta separatists, called him an ideological zealot, said he belonged to the mud hut wing of the BC New Democrats. Does that help the conversation between Alberta and British Columbia? What's your view on that kind of an approach?
I might say it a little bit more diplomatically. I think that the Premier of British Columbia is behaving in a way that's unconstitutional and un-Canadian. Everybody's been talking about how we can work together to expand new markets. I can tell you that when I go abroad, I support my fellow premiers. I talk about autos, I talk about steel, I talk about aluminum, I talk about germanium, I talk about his LNG exports. And so I would say that that's the spirit that people want to see Canadians and Canadian leaders operate in. And I think that he's offside with his own public. We've done some polling on this. 75% of Albertans, of Canadians want to see pipelines built. And so the good news is it's not in his hands. We have a Supreme Court that is determined that the reason why we gave trade and commerce power and the reason why we have ports and other cross-border infrastructure in the hands of the federal government is so that the parochial interests of an individual province can't stop development. So that's already been tested in court, and it's up to Mark Carney now, I think, to make his intentions clear, and that's why we're working with him.
But, you know, David Eby hears these words, but also people in British Columbia, you know, who may support the NDP or the Greens or others who may not be fans of a pipeline, they hear these words, and it has a larger, broader political effect. So I just wonder if you have any concerns that this galvanizes the opposition, that makes the political positions harder.
Well, it also galvanizes the supporters. I mean, we've got those who support pipeline development. We've got Indigenous nations and Indigenous groups that are standing up saying that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People includes the right to say yes so that they can develop resources, take an equity stake, have their own source revenue to be able to deal with local conditions. And we've walked the talk on that. We created the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. We've underwritten $750 million worth of projects, including pipeline projects. 43 out of the 44 nations in Alberta are beneficiaries of those agreements. And we want to expand that approach to include more nations in Alberta, but also to include nations in BC.
You said on social media this week, there is no universe where Alberta will tolerate being landlocked in our own country by our neighboring province. Have you talked to David Eby since you announced your proponent plan? Have you had a conversation with the Premier of British Columbia to try to find more common ground here?
Not yet. I mean, I did talk to him before we made the announcement, and my ministers have been making the phone calls to the Indigenous nations. I've met with Prime Minister Carney, and we've agreed that we're all going to work bilaterally and hopefully get to a trilateral table where we can discuss some of the issues. There's lots of ways in which Alberta and BC can work together. We have, for instance, a biodiesel plant that just opened, and most of the fuel based on canola is destined for the BC market. We want to talk about interties. We think that being able to have our wind and solar act as a backup to British Columbia hydro is actually a pretty good partnership. We have talked with the Prime Minister about developing nuclear, which would potentially create a robust regional market as well, and ammonia exports to the BC coast out of Port of Prince Rupert as well. So we have had lots of conversations about areas where we agree. I tend to like to focus on that, to talk about the areas where we can agree. And maybe there's a package there that will give the Premier comfort, especially when we start working with Indigenous communities so that we can secure that equity stake.
You mentioned the Constitution earlier there in your comments. There is going to be a case heard by the Supreme Court of Canada on the use of the notwithstanding clause, which is in the Constitution, but which gives governments and legislatures the authority to basically subvert specific charter rights. The federal government has tabled a factum with the court. They've intervened on this, seeking certain levels of clarity. You, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, Quebec's Francois Legault, and Tim Houston of Nova Scotia, you sent a letter to the Prime Minister asking him to withdraw that factum, saying this, the federal government's argument represents a complete disavowal of the constitutional bargain that brought the charter into being.
Yeah.
Why make this move? I mean, shouldn't the federal government intervene in cases like this of national interest to make its position heard, to let the court make its call?
Well, I look at it a little bit differently. The British parliamentary tradition is one based on parliamentary supremacy, and we had a compromise with the charter, which is what the Pierre Trudeau put forward. But it was my former premier, Alberta Premier Peter Lougheed, that said there's no way we can do this without having some measure of parliamentary supremacy, and that's what the notwithstanding clause is all about. I look at it, again, a bit differently. I think that we shouldn't allow 9 unelected appointed judges to subvert the will of the democratic will of duly elected members. Some of these issues do get resolved at the ballot box, and that's the appropriate place for some of these issues to get resolved. And that's part of the reason why I think we had this historic compromise. And no, it's not right for 9 unelected appointed judges to give themselves more power at the expense of this historic compromise that we've had since the 1980s.
But we have a charter and we have an independent judiciary to obviously uphold law, but also to protect minority rights in particular, which at the ballot box is where minorities can be subject to the tyranny of the majority. And there's a lot of people that look at what is happening with Bill 21 in Quebec and argue that the legislature is taking away the rights of specific religious minorities. So, I mean, do you not see the risk in going in the other direction, and the federal government stepping in to ask for clarity on this is a...
Well, I go back to some of the predecessors of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Diefenbaker's 1960 Bill of Rights, and as well as Peter Lougheed's 1971 Bill of Rights, and both of them contain a notwithstanding clause as well. I think as a nod to the British parliamentary practice. In the UK, the judges can render an opinion on whether something impacts rights, but ultimately it comes to the Parliament to decide whether or not they're going to amend their law. We're a bit of a hybrid in the American system. They had the conception of a Bill of Rights that I think that Trudeau brought here, but I think that the compromise and the nod to our historic tradition was to make sure that the ultimate decision rests in the hands of the elected bodies.
Right, but if the elected bodies have the right to keep rolling over the 5, because the notwithstanding clause, when invoked, lasts for 5 years. If you keep rolling that over, you are permanently erasing minority rights, are you not?
No.
And you not see a downside there and the preemptive use of it?
Well, if in fact the Parliament or the legislature is wrong, 5 years is the perfect time because you have a 5-year mandate when you get elected. And so if you're wrong, your people will tell you. And that is the ultimate accountability. If people disagree with how the legislatures are exercising their power, they'll get voted out. And I think that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be, again, 9 judges making that decision.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, good to see you in person. Thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
Well, BC Premier David Eby was asked today about the latest remarks from Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, specifically about her claim that he is being un-Canadian.
Right now, the province of BC, the Premier of BC, is not a threat to the pipeline project of the Premier of Alberta because there is no pipeline project. The only way currently that project is going forward is with tens of billions of dollars of public money. And if this is in fact another multi-billion-dollar federally funded Alberta project, then where is the multi-billion-dollar federally funded project in British Columbia? It's not the Danielle Smith show, it's the Canadian team. And we all deserve the same opportunity for the same federal funding for our projects as she does for hers. That's not un-Canadian, that is fair, and there is nothing more Canadian than fairness. That is a core national value.